Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Friday Discovery session. My name's Kelsey Brasil, and I am a project manager here at Efficiency Canada. And I'm your go-to gal for our new Discovery Career Hub. So I can drop that link into the chat later on. I do want to start off by acknowledging that Efficiency Canada operates within Carleton University, which sits on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. However, today I am calling you from the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So I'd like you to take a moment to just acknowledge the land that you're coming from here today on your call, and we can jump in today to our session. So before we get started, a quick reminder that our guests will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an open floor for questions. So feel free while Tom and Darryl are presenting to drop in any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll be sure to get to them once they're finished presenting and we're going into the Q&A session. We do have a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern. That way everybody can kind of wrap up their lunch, their breakfast, their afternoon snack, depending on where you are in the world. And yeah, so I'm very excited for today's presentation. I'd like to introduce you to Thomas Phoenix and Darryl Boyce. Tom Phoenix is a presidential member of ASHRAE and now works at Mechanical Contractors, Inc. And Darryl, as well, is a presidential member of ASHRAE and is the vice chair of ASHRAE's Government Affairs Committee. And today we're going to be doing a big deep dive into how international collaboration is creating new tools and standards for building decarbonization. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Tom and Darryl, and I'll leave it to you.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. Thank you. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Tom Phoenix, and I really am delighted to be invited to speak to you today. This is exciting. This is a topic area that we have been involved in for quite a while, and so I'm really excited and very thankful that you've invited us to share this with you. As Kelsey said, I'm a presidential member of ASHRAE. I'm also currently the chair of the ASHRAE task force for building decarbonization, and we will talk about that in just a minute. Some of you may not know about ASHRAE. I'm sure most of you do, but just in case, here's a little bit about us. We currently have over 51,000 members in 130 countries, so we're very much a global organization. We have been around for 127 years, and we're composed of lots of folks who are in the heating and air conditioning and refrigeration business, but basically the entire built environment arena. And so this slide here is a little bit about us. And this is our mission at ASHRAE: to serve humanity by advancing the arts and sciences of heating, ventilating, air conditioning, refrigeration, and their allied fields, to provide a healthy and sustainable built environment for all. So that's a little bit about ASHRAE. The topic of today, however, is carbon, which is the one topic that has absolutely taken over any discussions in the building industry and the built environment science. That this has really become the #1 thing in our industry and basically around the world. I mean, every day you hear things on the news about carbon emissions and climate change. So those of us that have been in the industry a long time, I have never seen anything take over the discussion like the carbon issue really has. Here's some facts about it. The last 5 years have been the hottest on record since 1850. And the rate of sea level rise has tripled since 1971. And last year, 2021, global CO2 emissions rose to their highest level in history. And so this is the issue that we now have to deal with around the world. And how do we fix this? Well, carbon is a big part of the the greenhouse gas emissions problem that's contributing to global warming. And so the goal, which has been accepted universally, is to get to net zero emissions by 2050. In order to do that, we need to cut our emissions in half by 50% each decade, but we want to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And that's the goal that's been somewhat universally accepted. So we work in the built environment. ASHRAE is all about the built environment and systems in buildings, but do buildings really make a difference? Well, here is a couple charts. The data is about 2 years old, but it's still very relevant today. And this first graph you see here shows that 35% of the energy in the that's being consumed around the world. This is a global statistic. 35% of the energy being consumed around the world comes from buildings, which is our industry. But 38% of the greenhouse emissions come from buildings. So do buildings make a difference? Absolutely. 38% of the total problem belongs to all of us who are in the built environment and building industry. So if we're going to tackle this problem, we do need to understand some definitions. And I will tell you, having worked in this arena now for a couple of years, the definitions are pretty critical. They actually are not the same around different parts of the globe and in different categories of study. But some of them you really need to understand. One is operational carbon. This is the carbon that is being used to power your building. Basically, anything that's being consumed in the building, including the energy to heat and treat water and wastewater, that's operational carbon. But that's not the only form of carbon that is being associated with the built environment. The other one is embodied carbon, and this is much harder to define and much harder to measure. But this is the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with the manufacture of materials that go in your building and the whole construction process of the building. A couple other terms that have become very important. One is carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, CO2e. This is a measure that's used to show the global warming potential of certain emissions. And finally, the life cycle assessment. You will hear a lot about this if you get into any discussion about reducing carbon. This basically is the sum total of all of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from a building through the entire life of the building up to and including the salvage and disposal of that facility. And so these are really important definitions for people to understand. There are also some challenges as we begin to attack this issue. The first problem is that there is no panacea. There's not, as the slide says here, one size does not fit all. There are many significant differences in what type of building that you have. There is also a huge discussion going on right now about new building construction versus existing building retrofit. As you see on the slide here, this is a pretty well-known statistic. 75% of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050, when we should be at net zero emissions, they're already built today. And so how do we go back and retrofit those buildings to make sure that they are net zero emissions? The fuel mix, whether it's gas, coal, nuclear, electric, whatever, it's a big part of this carbon discussion. And then the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, the approach is entirely different. 3 countries account for over 50% of all the carbon emissions: China, the US, and India. And, and so how do we deal with those countries versus how do we deal with underdeveloped countries? The chart, by the way, on the right there is basically the difference between commercial and residential fuel and emissions in U.S. buildings. This is a U.S. Energy Administrative statistic. The other issue is metrics. Should we focus on energy? I mean, for a long time, that's all we had were energy. We focused in the built environment about getting as efficient as possible. Or should we focus on the total carbon emissions, which includes both the embodied carbon and the operational carbon? Carbon offsets is a big debate. This is where if one person cannot achieve net zero, they can buy offsets from some organization or some other entity that has achieved net zero and is doing even better. So moving the ball around, basically. Right now, the approach to carbon offsets is very different around the world. As you see here, one example is there carbon offsets are allowed in the standards for CIBSE, or the Charter Institute over in the UK, but they're not allowed in the new ASHRAE standard. Benchmarks are different. There's no current measurement scale for a number of those definitions that we talked about. And then the embodied carbon availability of data is really sort of hit and miss at this point, and different ways to calculate embodied carbon are showing up again, depending on where you are and what type of building that you're in. So why is all this important to a group like ASHRAE? Well, if we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050, which is the goal, then it has been calculated that direct CO2 emissions from buildings have to be cut in half by the end of this decade, by 2030. And now that's only 8 years away. And so we have a lot of work to do. And that's why ASHRAE has decided to tackle this head on. If you're familiar with the Paris Agreement, there are 197 countries that have submitted what are known as NDCs, nationally determined contributions. The other reason that this is important to ASHRAE is that most of those countries mention buildings as a major contributor and mention them as a goal, but they really don't call out methods. Only 53 countries mention improving energy efficiency, and only 38 called out improving on building energy codes, which is one of the places that ASHRAE has a lot of experience. We have this, as we mentioned earlier, we're a global society, and we are certainly the recognized authority for energy usage and efficiency in buildings. So let me go through this pretty quickly. But one of the things that ASHRAE has done to tackle this problem is the development of a task force. Back in February of last year, President Gulledge and now President Mick Schwedler got together and appointed 15 people to form a task force for building decarbonization. This slide shows these nice photographs of all of us that are on the task force. Don Colliver and I are the co-chairs of this task force, and you may know some of these folks. And they literally are people from all different parts of the globe, and they represent all different parts of our built environment industry. Here are the objectives of that task force. We want to find and engage individuals with expertise. The 15 of us on that task force, we don't know it all, and we don't pretend to know it all. We are there basically to try to get ASHRAE moving, but we need experts in the field. And so that's the first thing we have to do. The second thing that is a goal is to make sure that the right information is in front of policymakers at state and national and local governments around the globe. And so that's a big part of one of the objectives. And finally, we're going to be developing a lot of tools and a lot of recommendations, and we want to provide those to the industry. So One of the things we have done is ASHRAE has a couple of documents that are very important. One is a public policy issues brief that has already been approved and submitted. We are also working on a position document. ASHRAE has position documents about a number of major topics in our industry. And so we have a committee already working, and in fact, the final draft of that was sent out this week for approval. So very, very soon you will see a position document from ASHRAE about decarbonization. I mentioned the fact that the 15 task force members don't do the work. We certainly do not. What we established were 9 working groups that will tackle each one of the areas of decarbonization. I'll show you that in just a second. Each one of the working groups staffed up and went to find their own roster of experts, and they developed all of these tools that I showed you on the last slide. And so that's the group that's coming together right now. We have a website already set up, as you can see, ashrae.org/decarb. And we are also planning a number of future conferences. We've already had a number of webinars, and there are changes to ASHRAE's standards and codes, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Here are the 9 working groups I mentioned. I won't spend the time to go through these individually, but you can see that each one of them is focused on a particular area that is relevant to trying to solve the carbon emissions problem. And each one of these working groups, we went out and found experts to try to help us out. And currently we have over 120 people working in these different groups, again, from all over the world and from all different parts of the built environment industry. One of the things I really want to announce to everyone is we are having on October 6th and 7th of this year, we will be hosting the first ASHRAE International Conference on Building Decarbonization. It will be in Athens, Greece. We already have a lot of people that are invited for speakers. We are going to have participation from the European Commission, UNEP, and several other organizations. So we're really, really, really excited about that. You can go to the website there you see on the screen, Decarb 2022, and that will give you all the information about the conference. So let me turn the presentation over to my good friend and colleague, Darryl, who's going to tell you a little bit about a lot of ASHRAE resources that will help with this effort.
Thank you, Tom. That's a great summary of what we're doing. And it is my pleasure to talk a little bit about what we have in terms of resources today. And we do have some standards and guidelines. 90.1 is the standard for buildings non-residential design, and 90.2 is the residential. 90.4 is the standard for energy standard for data centers, and 100 is the standard for energy efficiency in existing buildings. The IGCC is a code organization that adopted ASHRAE Standard 182, which is the standard for high-performing green buildings, and it's actually codified in that standard. 105 is the standard for expressing and comparing building energy performance and greenhouse gas emissions, relatively new standard. And what we have then is 228P, which Tom mentioned, which is a very new standard, which is a standard method of evaluating zero energy buildings performance. So we've heard a lot about greenhouse gas emission reductions at the federal government level of Canada and many other countries, but the fastest way really to do that is to reduce energy consumption and improve the operation of buildings so that you don't waste energy. So we also have some standards and guidelines around greenhouse gas emissions and refrigerants, standards 15 and 34. And we have, as I said, the standard also expressed embodied carbon is evaluating greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. In addition to that, we have training and education courses that are available through ASHRAE, various topics related to energy and carbon emissions. Next slide, Tom. So again, I talked about the building performance standards for existing buildings. Standard 100 is the energy efficiency in existing buildings. Standard 211 is commercial building audits, and they can be tailored for your jurisdiction. And there's ample technical support provided through ASHRAE in terms of training, briefings specific to your needs. And we are non-commercial, we're apolitical, we are a technical society, a not-for-profit technical society. So we're really here to support this journey to net zero, and we're continually updating our standards and guidelines to allow us to more effectively deal with the carbon emission reduction in the built environment. Next slide, please. So we also have a program that's called Building EQ. It's Building Energy Quotient. It was really designed to assess the energy use of a building. It's integrated with a level 1 energy audit, which identifies the means to improve the energy performance, including low cost and no cost energy efficiency measures, with an indoor environmental quality survey, which records measurements and provide additional information to assess the building's performance. So this program has been around for a while, quite focused on energy, but right now we're investing in upgrading the program to include the evaluation of carbon emissions as well. So we expect shortly to have a new and improved program available. And it's really focused on the end users, the building owners and operators of the building, so that they can evaluate their energy use and eventually carbon emissions, and then have a strategy and a program available to implement reductions in these areas, as well as track how well you're doing along the way. So it's something where annually you can put data in to see how well your initiatives are working. And so this is a program that we hope will be utilized heavily in the future. And we're hoping that this all works for you. So that's a summary of where we are with our programs to date, and a background on the issues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom and Darryl. So now we will open the floor up to questions. So if you do have a question for Tom or Darryl, please drop them in the Q&A box and I'll start to go through them. So we do have a question to kick us off from David Stewart. And it says, how do we get proper commissioning and further on energy management plans that track carbon use? And where will we get the green electric production to get off oil?
So I'll pick that up. Thanks for the question, David. Commissioning is a big part of what we're talking about at the task force. We have a couple of the working groups, particularly the operational carbon working group, that is looking at and working with the commissioning TC technical committee at ASHRAE. So you are absolutely right on target with your question. If buildings don't work properly, if they're not set up properly, no matter how well we get the building designed, it won't help with our emissions problem if it's not operating properly and it isn't commissioned. The second part of your question is a big discussion. As you might have noticed, I didn't leave the screen up very long, the slide up on the screen very long, but we do have a working group that's entitled Grid Intersection. It's all about working with the electric utility. And, you know, we have a similar problem in the US where we could make every building all electric. That would certainly solve the carbon emission problem from fossil fuel burning on a site-by-site basis, but that doesn't solve the carbon emission problem, because in the current environment, utility companies are still generate a lot of their electricity with fossil fuels. You mentioned oil in your question. In the US, a lot of it is generated with natural gas, and a lot of it is still generated with coal. In China, for example, most of their generation is coal. And so if you just solve the problem at the site, you've basically shifted the problem to the utility company. until utilities can become green. And I know there are efforts, there's certainly efforts here in the United States where I live. Most national and local and state governments are adopting regulations to require utility companies to become green by a certain date. So that's kind of how we're sort of doing all that.
Well, I could add just a little bit to the commissioning and building operations. In the last few years, ASHRAE has been in a position to change its global headquarters in Atlanta. And we took a 1970s building and updated it to today's technology. And it's a very effectively designed building, and we commissioned it into service. But now we're looking at other tools that will help us manage the operation of the facility. Analytics and fault detection software, the use of a digital twin. And so if you want to learn anything about what we're learning on the ASHRAE headquarters building, you can get that information off the ASHRAE website.
That's great, thank you. We have a question from Richard here that says, how can an ASHRAE member become involved with the Building Decarbonization Task Force?
Be careful what you ask for, Richard. You know, we are still, the working groups are still very active. And if you go to our website, I will be the first to admit to you that there's a lot of things that are missing that we really want to add to the website in terms of, you know, new products and new information, and all of that is coming from our working groups. The task force, the 15 members of the task force obviously were presidential appointees from the ASHRAE president, but the working group rosters are changing all the time, and we get requests constantly from people who would really like to help us with our research and our tool resource development and those kinds of things. So if you go to the website, you will see a little button on the website, a little bullet place on the website to send an email to us. And what that does is it sends an email to decarb@ashrae.org. I monitor that, Don Colliver monitors that, but more importantly, our staff members at ASHRAE monitor that. And if you just send them an email and say, hey, I would really like to be involved in this working group or that working group or whatever, we will respond to you, because we're always looking for help.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. We've got a question here in the chat from Aaron Taylor that says, which standards may be suitable for evaluating single-family residential buildings?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Darryl. It's your turn. You answer.
The most relevant standard is 90.2, which deals with residential facilities. And that's the one, and it's we actually have a residential committee in this society, and they're continually working on improving that standard as we move forward.
Great. Anything to add there, Tom? Well, no, I actually, Darryl, I had the same answer. 90.2 is where I would go, but as you saw from our slides, there are certain areas of building emissions that residences are the worst. And so that's one of the things that the operational carbon working group is looking at. They actually do have a little subcommittee that's looking at the differences between commercial and residential. So, you know, but the published standard is the one that Darryl mentioned. 90.2 is energy efficiency in single family residential buildings.
That's great. Okay, Martin Green has a question, and it says, what is ASHRAE doing with respect to district energy and thermal energy storage?
With respect to what the task force is doing, Martin, we've mentioned a couple things already. The whole issue of utility grid intersection and the whole issue of both embodied carbon and building performance standards. That's another one of our working groups. That all is sort of addressing that, but from the task force perspective, I will tell you, I don't think we have really tackled the whole district energy thing, you know, and I know a lot of cities and municipalities have a central energy plant for the whole city. Again, we are looking at that as it relates to basically it's a utility at that point, and the utility intersection is part of what we're looking at. But I don't know that I could point to anything that we're doing at the task force that's directly involved with the district energy thing. It should be. I mean, it's a great question. Thermal energy storage, we are looking at a lot because that's, you know, that's part of the demand shift, particularly if we're going to go all electric and those kinds of things. But anyway, that's, Darryl, I don't know if you've got any more to add to that or not, but.
No, and it's really actually quite challenging, the district energy area. But all I can say is that over the next few years, we're going to be looking at various aspects of energy utilization and decarbonization. So it may not be high on the profile right now, but over the next few years, it will definitely be addressed.
Thank you. Allie here says, building on earlier conversations on potential lack of clean electric grid, is ASHRAE considering natural gas heat pumps as a potential decarbonization pathway for replacing legacy boiler systems in buildings where electric grid is constrained?
So, Allie, the answer to that is a little complicated. A goal, you know, on the surface, and again, this has turned into an extremely complicated discussion about building decarbonization. On the surface of it, if you wanted to just simplify it, the goal is to eliminate all fossil fuels and the combustion of all fossil fuels. And so even natural gas heat pumps do some fossil fuel combustion. So does that mean they're a bad thing? No. And that's where this discussion gets a little fuzzy and a little more complicated, because we want to do whatever we can do. Heat pumps are a big discussion. I saw one of the things in the chat about somebody was talking about they had looked at and had been involved in the discussion that ASHRAE and NYSERDA are doing together. NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Group in the United States. And that whole thing is focused on heat pumps. Heat pumps work great down here where I live in North Carolina in the United States. They don't work so well in the wintertime up in where you live in Canada. And so heat pump technology is improving, and it will always and will continue to improve. And some of the approaches to using heat pumps will improve over time, but using fossil fuels to heat a building or to provide water heating is definitely going to be a little bit of it's going to be with us for a little while, I think. And again, we want to get down to having half of our emissions in buildings cut by 2030, but you know, there's some issues to overcome. Now, here's the good news. We've actually started looking at some really neat new technologies. There actually is a technology now called renewable natural gas, and so we're using it, but we're not throwing it away, and the emissions are almost zero. And so we've looked at some of those technologies, and then the whole fuel cell technology and hydrogen and some of that stuff. All kinds of new technologies are popping up that will probably have to be a part of this future.
Thanks, Tom. Darryl, do you have anything to add? Oh, my dog in the back.
Well, I guess just to reinforce what Tom said, is this is quite a journey. I said ASHRAE's here to help with the journey to net zero, but you know, this is a very complicated issue, and I think one of the critical things we do, and I mentioned it earlier, is that you need to reduce the energy consumption, and even if it's electrical energy, you need to reduce it so that the grid can handle more electrical services, right? It's an area where Over time, the technology will develop and we can change out our systems, but in the near term, we need to actually most effectively use the systems that we have. So this is, it's going to be a journey.
Absolutely. We had one comment in the chat that says, in order to switch to heat pumps, we need to improve the existing envelope. I'm not sure if you have a comment to David's comment there.
I agree with David 100%. You know, the built environment is a total package, and getting to zero carbon and zero energy in a building is a total package. Just improvements to the heating and air conditioning systems won't do it by themselves. You have lighting issues, you have surface water heating issues, you have wastewater treatment issues, and the built environment is a huge part of getting to zero. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's a great comment. I would agree 100%. You know, we can't, if we need to reduce the energy use in our buildings as much as possible, and that's the only way to get to have any shot of getting to net zero carbon. By the way, you mentioned the chat, and I looked up on my screen. I hadn't been looking at it while we've been answering these questions. And I want to give a shout out to Alice Yates, who is on the chat and filling in all the gaps that Darryl and I cannot fill in. Alice is our irreplaceable staff member at the ASHRAE Washington office. She is our staff liaison for the decarb task force. So thank you, Alice. Thank you for filling in all these gaps and answering these questions for everybody.
Yeah, and I can add just a little bit about the envelope issue. I talked about our new global headquarters building, where we took a 1970s building and upgraded it to today's standard. The first job we had, really the first thing we did, was work on the envelope to ensure it was a very high thermal resistance and well sealed. And that allowed us to get the building down to a level of energy consumption that we're able to put enough photovoltaics in, a reasonable amount of photovoltaics, to get us to what we believe will be a net zero operation. So that is critical. It's the first step in getting to net zero.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that, Darryl. And yes, thank you, Alice. You're also making my job a whole lot easier trying to manage both questions and chat. So I super appreciate that. I have a question for you too from one of my team members at Efficiency Canada. And they're asking, who would be a good fit to take courses and training at ASHRAE?
Who would be a good fit? Well, I mean, we have lots. The ASHRAE has a whole portfolio of courses that you can take for any kind of subject in the built environment. Basically, in the decarbonization arena, one of our working groups is actually the training and education working group, and we're developing, as we speak, we are developing 3 new courses to go into ASHRAE's portfolio. It's called the ASHRAE Learning Institute, ALI. We're developing 3 new courses from our decarbonization working group that will go into the ASHRAE portfolio. Those courses, actually, most of you know that we're coming to Canada in June. Our big summer meeting, our annual meeting, will be held in Toronto, and those courses will be presented at the Toronto meeting. But if you don't want to wait until June, you can log into ASHRAE and go to ashrae.org and go to a professional development page, and you will see the whole e-learning institute and the whole ALI portfolio of topics about decarbonization and anything else related to the built environment.
Yes, and we continue to work with other organizations, the Architects Institute of America, the Association of Physical Plant Administrators, BOMA and IFMA, and we're working with them to find out how we together can develop direction, training courses, guidance that would have a broad spectrum from design, construction, into operational training as well. So as we move forward, we'll be enhancing our training portfolio for sure.
That's great. Thank you. I think I'm going to wrap up there, but I'll invite Tom and Darryl to maybe drop their email in the chat if they'd like, in case I didn't get to people's questions today and they wanted to reach out to you, feel free to do that. I think I might wrap up with Pascal's comment here. He said, it's so refreshing to see such a big international organization taking the initiative to address such a complex issue. The only way to get to net zero is by mobilizing every sector, and the private sector have traditionally been the best innovators in society. I have worked on this issue from the government perspective for several years. This is very encouraging. I couldn't have said it better myself, so I thought I would give Pascal a moment there. And so, yeah, I just really want to thank Tom and Darryl for your time and your expertise today. And I want to thank everybody for joining us for another Friday Discovery session. We will be taking a break next week because it is Easter long weekend. So we'll see you back on the 22nd, which is Earth Day. So what a great time to reconvene. Thank you again. Enjoy your weekend, and please reach out to Tom and Darryl if you have any other questions for them. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend.